In what may be a preview of the 2020 election, a U.S. district judge has inserted herself into the Georgia election process. Now, in what turned out to be a convoluted and somewhat painful decision, we have a federal judge ordering the state of Georgia to violate both federal law and the Constitution of the United States. We'll talk more about that next on the Constitution Study.
There's one thing you have to know wherever you make your stand. Came from a long through line of everyday Americans.
Hello there, everyday Americans. Paul Engel here with the Constitution Study, where we read and study the Constitution and we teach the rising generation to be free. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for participating, for being part of this process. You know, I get comments and I get contacts, and I love it when people reach out to me and say, Paul, you know, this helped. What we're doing here made a difference. It helped somewhere. It helped explain something. It helped me understand something. It helped me stand up for my rights, and I'm hoping that you find it so useful you're ready to join, to be part of this. So please, if you find this stuff useful, share it. Share these messages wherever they can be found. I think if we share, we can help educate, and we can start a long process in returning the Constitution back to we the people. So with that, let's talk a little bit about this judge in Georgia. I found this AP article about a judge who ordered Georgia to extend their absentee ballot deadline. Now, my first reaction was that of suspicion that it was even constitutional for them to do so. So I did a little research. Now, it took some work, but I did finally track down a copy of the judge's order and dug through the mess to get to the pertinent facts. Now, there's an old adage that says, if you can't dazzle them with your brilliance, baffle them with, well, let's call it a barnyard substance. See, the New Georgia Project filed suit on behalf of 3 registered Georgia voters seeking an injunction against the enforcement of 5 parts of Georgia's absentee ballot law, claiming they not only violated several amendments to the Constitution of the United States, but U.S. law as well. Now, while most of the counts against the 5 statutes seemed ridiculous and were dismissed, one, the deadline for the receipt of absentee ballots, well, it was enjoined by the judge. So that is where I'll be focusing on this video. Now, Georgia Law 21-386A1F requires that absentee ballots be received by 7 p.m. Election Day to be counted. Plaintiffs complain that this imposed a severe burden on their right to vote and deprived them of their liberty without adequate procedural safeguards. Well, this didn't seem to be a problem to the plaintiffs. Normally, they claim that COVID-19 reaction makes it a problem. So let's start, as the court did, with the severity of the burden that is placed on the absentee voter. Plaintiffs noted that a record number of absentee ballots were requested for the Georgia primary, and they expect even more for the general election in November. One plaintiff received her absentee ballot the day before the election, making it effectively impossible for her to get her vote returned in time to be counted. The court noted that there were over 3,500 ballots received after Election Day in 2018, and over 7,000 were received after the deadline for the 2020 primary. The plaintiffs claim that this was due to Georgia's poor administration of absentee ballots, along with the policies they were challenging. What was not mentioned in the court's order was the postmark on those late ballots. Were the ballots mailed with sufficient time to reasonably expect them to be counted, or were they mailed at the last minute or even late? See, without that information, the court's point has no context to judge it by. Yet the judge assumes so in her decision. Quote, for example, in 2018, at least 3,045 of the 3,581 absentee ballots arrived within 7 days of Election Day, implying that many were mailed either before or on Election Day. But that's implying. That's an assumption. That's a guess. That's not proof. That's not evidence. That's an assumption made by the judge. The court also noted that a Wisconsin district court ordered an extension to that state's absentee ballot deadline based on similar circumstances. However, that decision was partially stayed by the United States Supreme Court, at least in part because the Wisconsin court did not put a postmark deadline in their order. Now, based on this and other cases involving uniformed services and overseas voters, courts have found that states that did not provide sufficient time to return absentee ballots imposed a severe burden on their right to vote. Now, the state claimed that a ballot postmarked by deadline or deadline extension would quote, frustrate the state's interest in conducting an efficient election, maintaining order, quickly certifying election results, and preventing voter fraud, close quote. What was not mentioned either by the state or the court was the constitutional deadline required for appointing electors in a presidential election. From Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, we read, the Congress may determine the time of choosing the electors and the day on which they shall give their votes, which day shall be the same throughout the United States. So Congress set the time for choosing electors in 3 U.S.C. Section 1. Quote, the electors of president and vice president shall be appointed in each state on the Tuesday next after the first Monday in November in every fourth year succeeding every election of a president and vice president. So the Constitution grants to Congress the authority to determine when electors must be chosen, which Congress has set to the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, what we call Election Day. Now, for the state to intentionally delay their appointment of electors not only violates federal law, but the Constitution as well. In the opinion of this judge, the state's interest in complying with federal law and the U.S. Constitution does not outweigh the burden the deadline places on absentee voters. From her order, quote, for these reasons, as applied to plaintiffs for the upcoming November 2020 general election, the court concludes that the state's asserted interests do not justify or outweigh the severe burden imposed on plaintiffs by the receipt deadline. As such, plaintiffs show a substantial likelihood of success satisfying the first of the preliminary injunction factors. But the court also finds that any additional procedures impose a minimal burden on the defendants because they already have an extended deadline. See, the court pointed out that the Federal Uniform Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act already extends the deadline for accepting absentee vote ballots. But we'll talk more about that later. Quoting from the opinion, plaintiffs will be forever harmed if they are unconstitutionally deprived of their right to vote. Defendants, on the other hand, argue that changing the deadline this close to the election will be burdensome on election officials, disrupt the state's statutory scheme for certifying elections, and undermine the integrity of the election process. Isn't that really substituting one problematic law to force a state to ensure another problematic law? I do agree with the court here. The harm done to the plaintiffs if they are deprived their rights far outweigh the stated concerns of the state, if not those of the Constitution. My real question then becomes, what is the best remedy? In her order, Judge Ross stated, it is well settled that an infringement on the fundamental right to vote amounts to an irreparable injury. From Elrod v. Burns, the loss of First Amendment freedoms for even minimal periods of time unquestionably constitutes irreparable injury. Thus, when a plaintiff has alleged her fundamental right to vote has been infringed, irreparable injury is generally presumed. I'm not sure how the plaintiffs and the court find a right to vote in the First Amendment. If voting is considered speech, maybe? I mean, it's not really petitioning the government for a redress of grievance. Therefore, since this was done by the legislature of the state of Georgia and not Congress, it cannot be in a First Amendment violation. I agree, the right to vote in this country is fundamental and should be protected. I'm just not sure where they find that in the First Amendment. Then again, I've come to expect courts to ignore the first three words of the amendment when they find it inconvenient. Now, continuing from the judge's order, plaintiff's proposed remedy, extending the deadline for receiving absentee ballots, would be a valuable measure to address the risk of absentee voter disenfranchisement. Extending the deadline will ensure that voters who receive their ballots shortly before Election Day are able to mail their ballots without fear that their vote will not count. So while the plaintiff's proposed remedy may address the risk of absentee voter disenfranchisement, it does so by forcing Georgia to violate federal law and the U.S. Constitution by not appointing their presidential electors by the required deadline. A quick search of the U.S. Constitution shows only that people have the right to vote, not to do so by mail. I agree that absentee voting should be allowed, but that the state should be required to do so in a manner that maintains the integrity of their officer's oath to support the Constitution of both their state and the United States. So what remedy does Judge Ross place in her order? Quote, here, plaintiffs request the court extend the absentee ballot receipt deadline by 5 business days. However, the court declines to grant plaintiffs' specific request and instead directs that defendants accept as otherwise valid absentee ballots from qualified voters that are postmarked by Election Day and arrive at their respective county's office within 3 business days after Election Day. So, in the attempt to split the baby, the court has ordered that Georgia accept valid absentee ballots that are postmarked by Election Day and received within 3 business days after the election. As a compromise between the positions of the plaintiff and the state of Georgia, well, this seems to be a pretty fair decision. What bothers me is the fact that the entire case appears to be a violation of the U.S. Constitution and a dangerous portent of what will happen in November. Why does this case bother me so? Well, first, we have to understand that there is no such thing in this country as a federal election. When there are elections for federal offices, all elections happen at the state level and are therefore controlled by state law. With the exception of ensuring that the people are not denied their right to vote based on their age from the 14th and 26th Amendment, their race, color, previous servitude from the 15th Amendment, their sex from the 19th Amendment, or their failure to pay taxes in the 24th Amendment, the federal government has no authority to meddle in these elections. Therefore, a federal court has no authority to order any state to modify its election process except to ensure the rights listed above. Personally, I would prefer that a state's legislature move up the date that they must legally send out absentee ballots to make sure that those voters have sufficient time to return them by Election Day. Either that, or Congress should amend 3 U.S.C. Section 1 to allow time for absentee ballots postmarked on Election Day to be counted before the date that states must appoint their presidential electors. What really concerns me is the foreboding preview this case represents. Imagine different courts all across the country telling states what ballots they do and do not have to count. Imagine the fights on the floor of Congress January 6th as representatives and senators from the different states challenged the vote counts based on the court-demanded method of counting absentee ballots, or, even worse, on who the electors in that state voted for. Now, this would not be something new. Did you realize that during the counting of the electoral votes on January 6, 2017, many members of the House of Representatives objected to the votes of certain electors? Would you be surprised that the only electors that were challenged were those who voted for Mr. Trump? Why did the American people not hear about this? Well, partially because what passes for the news media in this country is a joke, and partially because those who wrote 3 U.S.C. Section 15 ensured that one person could not disrupt the process of counting the votes. Quoting, "Every objection shall be made in writing and shall state clearly and concisely and without argument the ground thereof, and shall be signed by at least one senator and one member of the House of Representatives before the same shall be received." While members of the House, which was controlled by a majority from the Democratic Party, objected without a countersigned objection from a member of the Senate, the objection could not be received by the President of the Senate. That's the only reason it never went anywhere. So what are the American people to do when the courts insert themselves into the election process? It's one thing for lawyers and politicians to file suit. It's quite another for federal judges to allow themselves to be inserted into the process in violation not only of the separation of powers within the federal government, but the right of the states to hold their elections in a manner chosen by their state's legislature. Sadly, I foresee a potential coup d'etat this November. Have you asked yourself what your representatives will do in your name and in the name of your state? Will your representatives attempt to overturn an election to get the outcome they want? Will their associates attempt to illegally bring the federal courts into the process to take control? What will you do about it? Will you support those in your state government who stand up to these revolutionaries? Will you help put down such an insurrection? And what about those who will riot and destroy if they don't get their way? Are you prepared to defend yourself and your family along with their rights? Will you demand that all parts of our governments do so by our consent, not that of some political party or faction? While we should all pray for the best, we should also prepare for the worst. If recent events have taught us anything, it should be that there are those who will not only use the levers of power to take control of you, your business, and your family, but others are more than willing to use violence and intimidation to get their way. Are you willing to stand your ground, or are you merely a sunshine patriot? Because the country that you leave to your children will not only be decided by this election, but by our willingness to stand against those who wish to overthrow the sovereignty of the American people. As Thomas Paine said, these are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. So I don't know about you, but I'm praying that we don't have the problems I foresee come this November. I would be quite happy if the election is decided on Election Day, at least the presidential election. Yeah, there'll be some outliers here, but if we're pretty solid that the elections for the president, vice president, House, Senate, all the state offices, if they're pretty much settled, that would make me very happy. However, as I look at what's going on, my gut tells me that's not going to be the case. My gut tells me that Bush v. Gore from 2000 will be a cakewalk based on what may happen November 7th. I foresee lawsuits and judges' orders and counter orders and arguments and disagreements, and now I even think there may be a fight in the Congress itself as different factions challenge the other party's electors. This is the mess our founders tried to keep us out of, at least when they set up the presidential election system, because we're turning America into exactly what our founding fathers did not want it to be, a democracy. And we're getting the results they expected. Chaos, riots, the country's murdering itself. The question I have for you, will you stand up? Are you a sunshine patriot? Are you a summer patriot? Are you willing to sit back and whine and complain, but not actually stand up and do something? You know, they say when the going gets tough, the tough get going. Are we too weak to get up out of our chairs? To walk away from social media? To engage and stand with our representatives who are standing for the truth, who are standing for the Constitution, who are standing for the rule of law? Or will we sit back and watch while those who will do anything to get their way take over this country? Are we prepared for the fact that there may be people who riot because they don't get their way? Because if you look at the big cities around this country, that's not only possible, that seems fairly likely. What will you do if riots come to your town? Now, I live out in the middle of nowhere. I live in a very small town in rural Tennessee. But I'm meeting with my sheriff in part to talk about what happens if things get crazy in this county. What will he do? What will his deputies do? And what can I do to help? We should all do that. So if you want to engage, if you want to become part of the solution rather than part of the problem, start preparing. Talk to your representatives. Talk to your sheriff. Make a plan to be engaged, recognizing that while we hope nothing bad happens, we should prepare that it just might. And if you thought this was useful, do me a favor, head over to the website, constitutionstudy.com. And if you found value in this, consider donating to the Constitution Study. Consider donating to the podcast. That donate button, any money you donate there goes to putting on and growing and improving this podcast. You know, I get comments and I get notes when I hear from people who say this podcast helped them. It did change something. It did make a difference. And you can be part of that too by helping make sure that the Constitution Study podcast keeps going out and keeps being spread as far and wide as possible. If you can help monetarily, great. If you can simply share these messages, wonderful. If you want me to be able to go and do more in-person events where I don't have to charge somebody for my expenses to go out and visit places, then consider going to the website to hit the shop button and buy something. You can donate to a cause there. You can buy a membership. You can buy a book. That money helps me put on these events. I'm going to a few local shows here in the next few months, and I've got some other things in the works. I'm trying to do this all on my own. And if you want to come alongside and help, one, it would be greatly appreciated. But it's good to know that the work we're doing here is making a difference. You may not see us on the nightly news. You may not see us in your news feed or on social media, but there are people that this this podcast and the work that we're doing is impacting positively. And if you can come alongside and help spread the word, help bring me to your location, help fund the work that we're doing, that would be wonderful. Most of all, I hope you find value in what is being brought here in the podcast. Enough value that you will come back and we can discuss the Constitution right here on the Constitution Study.
There's one thing you have to know wherever you make your stand. Came from